The evening began with the familiar sound of Elowyn's heels striking the hardwood floor of my hallway, sharp as a gavel against my peace. She didn't knock, didn't pause. She never did. At 32, she still stormed through my home as if it were an extension of her moods, and tonight, those moods were running high. "Mom," she called, appearing at the doorway of my study, "let me have the Mercedes tonight, just for a few hours. There's a gala in Charleston, and everyone expects me to arrive in style." I set my reading glasses on the desk and folded the letter. I had been rereading one of Silas's old notes from the years before he died. My late husband had always cautioned me about giving in to Elowyn too quickly, but I hadn't listened enough. Even now, decades later, I still felt the pull between firmness and weakness when she demanded something. "Elowyn," I said. Careful to keep my voice even. "The Mercedes isn't for parties. It's a piece of your father's history and mine. I can't risk it on another night out. You know, last time you returned it with scratches and the tank bone dry." Her arms crossed, nails glinting under the lamplight. "So, you're just going to let it rot in the garage?" Everyone borrows from their parents. "It's just a car." "It is not just a car," I answered, and the answer is no. Her lips tightened, and for a moment, her face was a portrait of my younger self. Stubborn, unyielding, convinced the world owed her something. Then, without another word, she spun on her heel and left the door slamming behind her, hard enough to rattle the framed photographs on my wall. I picked Silas's letter back up, tracing the handwriting as if it could anchor me. I knew the night was not finished. Hours later, long after I should have been asleep, a thunderous crack jolted me upright. My first thought was a storm, but the sky had been clear. Then came the voice. Elowyn's voice, cutting through the silence. "Mom, your car is burning." I raced down the hall, the robe tightening around me as I ran. Outside, the air was thick with smoke, and the driveway glowed orange. The Mercedes stood in flames, paint, curling rubber, shrieking against fire. I froze on the threshold. My hand pressed to my chest, unable to breathe. It wasn't until I turned my head that I saw her. Elowyn stood at the edge of the blaze, her face washed in the dancing light. She wasn't holding a hose or a phone pressed to her ear. She was holding her phone out, camera pointed at the inferno, the blue glow of a live feed reflecting in her eyes. She smiled, not broadly, but enough. A flicker, quick and poisonous, as if the fire had warmed something deep inside her that had waited for this moment. "Mom, look," she shouted again, her tone almost playful. "It's really burning." Neighbors began to stir doors, creaking open voices, calling into the smoky night. Someone dialed the fire department, someone else ran for a bucket, but Elowyn stayed rooted, recording the spectacle as if it were entertainment. The realization struck me harder than the heat my own daughter preferred to capture my ruin rather than prevent it. I forced my legs to move, edging closer, but the flames leapt higher, pushing me back. The smell of burning leather oil and memory clawed at my throat. This car wasn't only a machine, it was the last tangible link to the man who had built our life from cloth and grit. I had polished it after his funeral, promised myself it would outlast my grief. And now it was crumbling piece by piece under the indifferent eye of the very child we had raised. Elowyn lowered the phone slightly, catching my gaze across the smoke. For a breathless instant there was no sound but the crackling fire between us. Then she shrugged almost casually and lifted the phone again. The fire trucks arrived, sirens slicing the night, neighbors pointing, murmuring. I stepped back into the shadows, letting their shouts drown out the roar in my ears. My daughter had lit something far more dangerous than gasoline. She had ignited the truth of who she had become. And as the flames devoured the Mercedes, I realized the blaze was only the beginning of a far darker reckoning. I clenched my robe tighter, retreating into the house where the cameras I had installed just weeks earlier were waiting quietly, storing the proof that this night was no accident. The night air pressed hot and thick against my skin as I stepped off the porch. Smoke clawed at my lungs, and the blaze painted the sky with a savage orange. The Mercedes was no longer a car, it was a pyre. Each snap of burning metal carrying years of my life into the air. My neighbors hurried from their porches in robes and slippers, some with buckets, some with only their voices raised in alarm. "Call the fire department," one shouted. Another tried to run forward, but stopped short at the wall of heat. A child clung to her mother's leg, staring wide-eyed at the chaos. The neighborhood that usually held only cicadas and quiet conversations now pulsed with panic. In the middle of it stood Elowen. She held her phone at arm's length, angling herself so that her face glowed in the firelight. For a moment it looked as though she were part of the inferno, her features sharpened by the orange glare. Then I saw that faint curl of her lips, the smallest suggestion of a smirk. Not grief, not fear, not even surprise, just satisfaction. I wanted to scream, to shake her until she understood what she had destroyed. Instead, I pressed my trembling hands against the folds of my robe, pinning them there until my knuckles ached. I would not give her the theater of my collapse. If she wanted to watch me crumble through that lens, she would leave disappointed. Neighbors rushed to my side, voices colliding in a rush of sympathy and curiosity. "Ms. Duval? Are you all right? Did anyone call 911? Do you know what happened?" Their questions swirled around me, but I could only nod mutely. My eyes remained fixed on Elowen. She lowered her phone briefly when the sirens wailed in the distance, the approaching fire engines cutting through the night. She glanced at me, our eyes locking. And there it was again, that glimmer of triumph so fleeting it might have been imagined, yet I knew it wasn't. I had raised that face. I had kissed that forehead when it was fevered as a child. I could read her expressions better than I could my own. The fire crews surged into the driveway, heavy boots thudding hoses unfurling. Commands rang out sharp and practiced. Water hissed as it struck the flames, sending up clouds of steam that wrapped around us like ghosts. Neighbors stepped back, shielding their faces. The blaze began to choke and shrink, leaving behind a twisted skeleton where the Mercedes had once gleamed. Through the smoke, I watched Elowen slip her phone into her coat pocket. Her expression turned blank, almost innocent, as if she had been just another bystander. But the image of her smile was seared into me more deeply than any scorch mark on the driveway. "Could have been worse," muttered a neighbor beside me. Good thing nobody was inside. I managed a polite nod, though my mind had already shifted away from sympathy. I wasn't thinking about loss anymore. I was thinking about evidence. My cameras. The ones I had installed out of caution, claiming it was for safety after a rash of burglaries in the area. In truth, I had installed them because I knew my daughter's temper was a storm I could no longer predict. I stepped backward into the shadows as the firefighters finished their work. The wreck steamed and hissed a black husk with nothing left to offer but memories. People murmured condolences. A few placed hands on my arm. Gentle touches meant to comfort. I thanked them softly, but my thoughts were elsewhere. Elowen finally walked over, brushing ash from her sleeves, as if she had simply wandered too close to someone else's disaster. "Mom," she said smoothly, "I'm so sorry. I don't know how it started." Maybe a short circuit. You've always said the car was old. I looked at her face, her perfect mask of concern, and felt the fire still burning inside me, hotter than the one that had destroyed the car. I swallowed it down, letting my voice remain calm, even gentle. Perhaps I murmured, "We'll find out soon enough." I turned, then heading back into the house. Behind me, the firemen's voices faded into the night. Inside, the cameras waited patient and silent, holding the truth I already knew I would need. By the time the last fire truck pulled away, the neighborhood had emptied of curious eyes. Only the stench of smoke remained clinging to the azaleas and settling into the fabric of my robe. I stood at the kitchen sink with the lights off, watching Elowen from the window as she paced in the driveway, her phone glowing against the dark. She looked restless, not shaken. There was no grief in her posture, only the nervous twitch of someone waiting for confirmation that their plan had succeeded. But she had miscalculated. The Mercedes held more than leather seats and polished chrome. Weeks earlier, I had tucked a suitcase into the trunk, the kind of hard case designed to resist both fire and water. Inside, it was my future work, or rather, the work I wanted to leave behind when I was gone. $200,000 in cash counted and bundled, intended for a women's resilience fund I had spent years sketching in my journals. A small legacy not for my daughter, but for strangers, single mothers starting over, women rebuilding after losses like mine. I hadn't told Elowen. She would never have understood why I planned to pour so much of what she saw as her inheritance into women she'd never meet. She already called my donations performances as if generosity were vanity. What she didn't know was that the suitcase was more than money. It was a promise I made to myself on the day Silas was lowered into the ground, that his life built from nothing but grit and fabric scraps would continue to ripple outward, helping hands I'd never shake. When the firefighters opened the trunk hours earlier, their faces lit with surprise. Amid the ruin, the case sat blackened but intact. One of them tapped it with his boot, muttering about lucky steel. I said nothing, only watched as it was pulled free, still locked tight. They assumed it was empty luggage, just another casualty saved by chance. I let them believe it. Later, when the house was silent and Elowen had gone to bed in the guest room, I carried the case into my study. My fingers trembled as I spun the combination, half expecting the heat to have warped the mechanism. But it opened smoothly. The bundles were there, untouched, smelling faintly of smoke, but otherwise immaculate. Above them lay a sealed envelope of documents, drafts of the fund's charter lists of contacts, handwritten notes in my husband's hand from decades earlier when we had first spoken about giving back. I traced his signature as if it were still warm. The fire had taken the Mercedes, but not him, not me, not the future we had intended. For the first time that night, relief shuddered through me, almost painful in its release. I closed the case again and slid it beneath my desk, where shadows swallowed it whole. Elowen's footsteps sounded above me, quick, clipped, impatient. She was likely posting her curated grief online, a performance for followers who would comfort her with hollow hearts and emojis. Tomorrow, she would wear that same mask before neighbors and officials, perhaps even before the police. But no filter would ever erase the image burned into my mind, her smile, as the flames rose higher. I leaned back in my chair, inhaling the bitter scent that still lingered on my skin. She believed she had destroyed something irreplaceable, that she had scorched the one possession I guarded most. She believed she had won. But the fireproof box had survived, and with it, every plan she thought she had turned to ash. The night's silence thickened, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ping of Elowen's phone upstairs. I reached for Silas's letter on my desk, the one I had folded earlier when she barged into my study. His words steadied me, their ink reminding me of the man who built not just a business, but a family, however fractured it had become. I knew what must come next. If Elowen had set fire to my past, then my cameras had captured the spark that betrayed her. And in the morning, I would begin the quiet work of making sure the truth could not be denied. Sleep never came to me that night. Even after the last embers cooled and the neighborhood quieted, I sat in my study, the suitcase at my feet, Silas's letter folded neatly on the desk. My eyes refused to close, and my mind refused to rest. The scent of smoke clung to everything, the curtains, my hair, even the polished wood of the floor. I could not wash it away, nor could I ignore the image that replayed each time I blinked, Elowen's smirk framed by fire. It was nearly 3 a.m. when I rose and crossed to the cabinet in the corner. I unlocked it with a key I kept hidden in a teacup, then powered up the security system that had been installed just 2 weeks earlier. The cameras had seemed excessive then. Now they felt like prophecy. The monitor glowed in the dark, its light cutting sharp across the room. I cued the feed from the garage and pressed play. For a moment, only shadows filled the frame. The driveway under the hush of midnight, my beloved Mercedes gleaming under the weak floodlight. Then movement stirred. A hooded figure slipped into view. My chest tightened as I leaned closer. The figure's movements were deliberate, not hurried, not panicked. A gas can appeared in her hand, the liquid sloshing as she tipped it against the car. The flames took a moment to catch, but when they did, they erupted as if starved for years. And then came the detail no one could argue with: the bracelet. A slender silver chain with a small jade charm that glimmered when the firelight flared. Elowen's bracelet. The one she never removed, not even when swimming, not even when sulking in her room as a teenager. It had been her 16th birthday gift, chosen by her father, and she had clung to it as proof of being his favorite. Now it glinted like a confession. I paused the footage and pressed my fingertips against the screen. My reflection overlapped with hers. 2 women bound by blood, but separated by choices neither of us could undo. The proof was undeniable. Still, I felt no triumph. Only sorrow, heavy and suffocating. Carefully, I copied the footage onto a flash drive and slid it into the sewing kit I kept by the window. It was a small box of needles and thimbles that no one ever touched, not even Elowen. If she rummaged through my desk, the kit would look like clutter. If she searched my drawers, it would seem invisible. My hands steadied as I tucked the drive beneath spools of thread. Next, I uploaded a copy to the cloud account Matthias had helped me set up years earlier under the guise of estate planning. He had insisted that redundancy was safety. I had thought him overly cautious then, but tonight I whispered my gratitude to him under my breath. The monitor still glowed, showing the frozen image of my daughter in her hood. I sat back down, folding my arms around myself, and let the silence expand. The house creaked under the weight of the night, and upstairs I could hear Elowen's footsteps as she moved about her room. Perhaps she was replaying her own footage, the video she had streamed for strangers who would never know the truth behind her smile. Perhaps she believed the evidence had burned away with the car, but the cameras had watched without judgment, capturing everything with the patience of machines. And now, the truth belonged to me. I closed the cabinet, turned off the monitor, and returned the key to its porcelain hiding place. My body sagged with exhaustion, but my mind remained sharp. Elowen thought the fire had given her power. She didn't realize that her reflection had already been caught in the dark, glittering with a jade charm. I blew out the lamp and left the study in shadows, the faint hum of the refrigerator guiding me back through the kitchen. The truth waited quietly in the threads of my sewing kit, safe and untouched, ready to be unveiled when the moment demanded it. Morning crept into the house, heavy with smoke. Even after the firemen had gone and the wreckage had been hauled away, the scent clung to the curtains and drifted down the halls like a stubborn ghost. I rose before dawn, unable to sleep, and printed a single still frame from the footage. The jade charm gleamed clearly in the firelight, unmistakable against the sleeve of a hooded figure. I slid the paper into a folder and set it on the kitchen table beside the sugar bowl. By the time Elowen appeared, the kettle had begun to whistle. She walked in wearing one of my silk robes, hair twisted into a careless knot, her phone still in her hand. She looked fresh as morning itself, as though she had slept soundly, while I lay awake with the truth. "Rough night," she sighed, pulling out a chair. "I still can't believe it. Maybe the wiring finally gave out. Old cars, you know, they don't last forever." I poured her a cup of tea and placed it in front of her. My hands were steady, though my chest felt like a drum. "Yes," I said softly. "Old things do break eventually." She picked up the cup, avoiding my eyes. I reached across the table and opened the folder. The photograph slid into the light between us. The colors of flame and shadow filled the frame, but the bracelet shone brightest, catching the fire like a jewel. Her hand froze midway to her lips. For a second, she stared as though she didn't recognize it. Then her mouth curved into a thin line. "That could be anyone," she muttered. "Half the town wears jewelry." "But not that bracelet," I replied. "Your father gave it to you. You never take it off." Her cheeks flushed crimson, though she tilted her chin upward in defiance. "So now I'm on trial, in my own mother's kitchen." Before I could answer, the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the house, cutting clean through the tension. Elowen flinched, then pushed her chair back with more force than needed. I rose and opened the door to find Inspector Jonah Rourke standing on the porch. He was a tall man in his 50s, with tired eyes, his notepad already in hand. The smell of smoke followed him in as though it had embedded itself into his uniform. "Mrs. Duval," he said, with polite gravity, "I'm here to ask a few questions about the fire. May I?" I stepped aside and led him into the kitchen. Elowen straightened quickly, forcing her face into a mask of surprise. "Inspector?" she greeted. "This is all such a shock. We were lucky no one was hurt." Jonah glanced at me, then back to her. "Indeed. Fires like this rarely start without a reason. Did either of you notice anything unusual yesterday?" Elowen launched into her story, smooth and rehearsed. She spoke of hearing a pop in the garage, of seeing sparks, of running outside, only to find the Mercedes engulfed. She claimed she had called out for me, her voice dripping with concern. Her eyes watered at the right moments, her hands trembled faintly as she gestured. I sat silent, letting her words weave themselves into the air. Jonah scribbled notes, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he closed his notebook with deliberate care. "Thank you, Miss Duval," he said. "Sometimes accidents do happen, but we'll need to review all available information. Mrs. Duval, I'll be in touch about the insurance and an official statement." I nodded, my gaze steady on the inspector. He lingered for a breath, then tipped his hat and left his footsteps fading down the porch steps. Elowen exhaled the performance draining from her shoulders. "See?" she said, forcing a laugh. "Accidents, that's all." I slid the folder back toward me, tucking the photograph out of sight. Her lie still hung in the air between us, fragile and desperate. but the evidence breathed quietly in the drawer at my side. And I knew it was only a matter of time before silence gave way to truth, because truth always does. The morning slipped into noon with a thickness that clung to my skin. Elowen had retreated upstairs, slamming her door with the drama of a teenager, though she was well into her 30s. I sat at the kitchen table with the folder, closed the printed still frame tucked inside, and the smell of smoke still seeping through the vents. The silence of the house pressed against me until I reached for the phone. The first call was to the insurance company. Their hold music trickled through the receiver, too cheerful for the ashes outside my window. When the adjuster finally came, on his tone was clipped, perfunctory. I gave him the details, the model, the year, the value. I described the fire, repeating the facts without embellishment. His voice softened slightly when I said I was 70 years old and alone at the time. He promised a claims inspector would come within the week. I thanked him, hung up, and immediately dialed the second number, the one that mattered more. Matthias Crowell. The voice answered, firm, low, and familiar. Matthias, it's Aurelia. My voice cracked, though I hadn't intended it. I need you. There was a pause. Then the rustle of papers. I saw the report about the fire this morning. Local news posted it already. Are you safe? Yes, I said. But it wasn't an accident. I told him about the cameras, the footage, the bracelet. I told him how Elowen had smiled while the car burned, how she spun lies at breakfast, how Inspector Rourke had written down her words as though they carried weight. I hesitated only once when I mentioned the suitcase. There was money in the trunk, I admitted, lowering my voice, though no one was listening. 200,000 for the Resilience Fund. The women who come to me have nothing. Matthias, nothing but shame and hunger. That money was their chance to stand again. I could almost hear him pressing his palm to his forehead the way he always did when thinking, and it survived in a fireproof lockbox. Untouched. The silence on the line was thick, but not empty. It was his kind of silence, heavy with calculation. When he spoke, his tone was colder than before, but steadier too. Sometimes fire is not loss, it's proof, he said. If Elowen meant to wound you financially, she failed. If she meant to erase your independence, she revealed herself instead. Aurelia. This could be the hinge on which everything turns. His words landed deep, as though they belonged more to fate than to law. I let them settle before asking, what should I do? For now, nothing rash. Keep the footage secure. Say nothing to her. When the insurance inspector comes, provide only what's required. Let the official process begin its march. Meanwhile, I'll prepare. If she pushes further, or if the authorities hesitate, we'll already be 3 steps ahead. I closed my eyes, pressing the receiver against my cheek. Matthias had been my lawyer for 15 years, but more than that, he had been my ally in silence. He knew the battles I'd fought in boardrooms, the betrayals I'd endured at my ex-husband's side, the nights I'd sat at his desk, drafting donation contracts, while my daughter sulked in another room. He had been witness to the resilience I'd built stitch by stitch. Matthias. I whispered, I don't want this to end with her in prison. She's my daughter. I understand, he said gently. But understand this too. She lit the match. Now you decide whether you smother the smoke or guide it into a fire that cleanses. His words left me still caught between grief and grim resolve. The line hummed in my ear until he added, I'll come by tomorrow. We'll set the groundwork. When I hung up, the house was quieter than ever. I looked at the ceiling where Elowen's footsteps had stomped hours earlier. The proof lay waiting in a sewing kit, the money sat hidden in my study, and the law was beginning to stir awake. And though the Mercedes was gone, I felt the faintest sense that the real trial had only just begun. When the house finally sank into quiet, I went to my study and unlocked the cabinet where I had placed the suitcase. The weight of it felt heavier than its contents suggested, as though the fire had melted all the years of hope and betrayal into the leather handle. I carried it to the desk, lowered it gently, and twisted the key. Inside sat the fireproof lockbox, scorched on the edges, but unbroken like a heart that had endured too much. My fingers traced the steel before I lifted it out. I had thought of it only as a vessel for the 200,000 a tool for my fund. But as I pressed the code and felt the click, I remembered there was something else inside. Something I hadn't touched in nearly a decade. The lid opened with a groan, and the scent of paper and metal filled the air. The bundles of cash were there, crisp bills wrapped in bands untouched by flame. But resting atop them was a small stack of envelopes tied with the same thin cord Silas had always used for everything from packages in his textile days to notes he left on my pillow when traveling for business. My breath caught. I had nearly forgotten he'd asked me to keep them with the car. He had said once, half smiling, "When the car goes, let the memories go with it. Until then, they'll stay together." My hands trembled as I pulled out the bundle of letters. The paper was yellowing now. Ink faded, but his handwriting still pressed with the confidence of a man who thought he had more time than he did. The first envelope bore my name in full, Aurelia Duval. I sat down, cash and fire forgotten, and slipped the paper free. "My Aurelia," it began. "If you are reading this, it means the Mercedes is still with you. Keep it as a reminder that all we built was not in vain, even if the world forgets us. This car is not metal. It is the proof of our nights spent risking everything. It carries your resilience, my faith, and our dreams stitched into its leather." I held the page closed, my eyes blurring. The car had been Silas's last gift, his way of saying that, after decades of late nights and bitter negotiations, something beautiful had survived. And now, Elowen had tried to turn it into cinders. One by one, I read the rest, each letter a different year, a different stage of our life together. In one, he described watching Elowen's first recital, how she twirled in her dress while I clapped from the front row. In another, he confessed how proud he was of me for holding the company together when illness pulled him away. The final one was shorter, more fragile in tone. "If one day you must stand alone, let this car remind you that you already know how. It is yours. Aurelia, mine only in spirit. Promise me you'll never forget what it took to earn it." I pressed the letter against my chest. The fire had stolen the Mercedes, but not his words, not his faith in me. When I returned the letters to the box, I placed them above the cash as if to remind myself of what truly mattered. The money was survival, but the letters were soul. I closed the lockbox, securing both fortunes together, the one for the world and the one only for me. Then I slid it back into the suitcase, shutting the clasps with deliberate finality. The house was silent, but I felt Silas's presence settle in the room like the warmth of an old shawl. Elowen thought she had burned a car. She had no idea she had awakened the memory of a man who still stood with me even in death. I carried the suitcase back to its place steady this time, knowing that what it held was more than fire could ever take. And when I turned off the light, I knew that the next step was not about cars or cash. It was about guarding the legacy of the man whose letters still burned brighter than any flame. The night after reading Silas's letters, I could not sleep. Every word clung to me, not as comfort, but as a mirror. He had trusted me to carry forward the strength we built together, Yet I had spent years softening every edge, blunting every lesson when it came to Elowen. I had mistaken love for indulgence and indulgence for safety. Now I sat in the wreckage of that mistake, staring at the daughter who had grown into entitlement like a second skin. I remembered the early months after Silas's death. Elowen was 20, then listless and furious at the world for daring to rob her of her father. I had seen my own grief reflected in her, and instead of guiding her through it, I smothered it with gifts, excuses, and silence. When she demanded money for courses she never finished, I gave it. When she brought home friends who drained her spirit and my patience, I said nothing. When she snapped at me, her words laced with venom, I told myself it was grief speaking. But years later, when the grief had dulled, the venom remained. By dawn, I had brewed coffee strong enough to burn the tongue. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the steam when a knock sounded at the door. Not forceful, just the polite rhythm of someone who had knocked on my door 100 times before. I opened it to find Marigold Hensley, my neighbor of 3 decades, balancing a covered dish in her hands. Her silver hair was coiled tightly, and her eyes always sharp softened as they met mine. "I brought cornbread," she said. "You shouldn't have to cook on a day like this." The smell reached me before her words fully settled. Sweet, buttery, familiar. I stepped aside, and she walked in as though she had lived here all her life. She set the dish on the table, removed the cover, and filled the air with warmth that almost fought the lingering scent of smoke. "Sit," she urged. "Eat something. Grief and fire both take strength out of you." I sat, though my appetite was gone. She poured herself coffee, folding her hands neatly on the table. For a while, we ate in silence, her cornbread crumbling soft in my mouth. Then her gaze unwavering cut through the quiet. "It was Elowen, wasn't it?" she asked. The question did not accuse, nor did it pity. It was a simple truth wrapped in the voice of someone who had seen enough to recognize patterns. I set my fork down. "She was my girl," I whispered. I tried to fill the hole Silas left. I filled it with ease, with indulgence, with saying yes when I should have said no. Marigold leaned back in her chair, her expression grave. "We all give too much when we're afraid to lose more. But Aurelia, you know as well as I do, spoiled roots don't straighten on their own." Tears pressed hot behind my eyes, though I willed them not to fall. "Then this is my fault. Every demand she makes, every lie she tells, it's me? I created it." Marigold reached across the table and placed her hand over mine, the gesture firm, steady. "You didn't create her cruelty. You gave her tools, yes, but she chose how to use them. Don't mistake your softness for her malice. They are not the same thing." Her words were a balm and a blade. I had wanted someone to share the blame, but she offered clarity instead. I had been complicit in Elowen's shaping, yet the fire, the smile, the betrayal that belonged to her alone. When Marigold left the house, felt quieter, but less suffocating. I wrapped the remaining cornbread in a towel and placed it on the counter. Then I stood by the window staring out at the blackened skeleton of the car. The reflection in the glass showed a woman who had indulged too long, forgiven too much, and avoided too many confrontations. But I could not keep her shape forever. If I had been the architect of Elowen's entitlement, I now had to decide whether I would also be the architect of her consequences. The choice pressed down on me like the weight of smoke, lingering, waiting, demanding to be faced, as the day carried me toward what had to come next. By mid-afternoon, I had decided that silence would no longer serve me. The truth sat too heavily in my chest, and the weight of the footage in my sewing kit was beginning to feel like a stone pressing against my ribs. If Alawan thought she could outlast me with her deflections, she would soon learn I had more patience than she ever imagined. I set the table with china Silas had given me on our 30th anniversary. Tea roses patterned the porcelain delicate but enduring, much like the marriage we'd built. I brewed Earl Grey, steeping it dark and fragrant. On a plate, I arranged the cornbread marigold, had left a gesture of neighborly grace I intended to wield like a sword, gentle in form, sharp in purpose. When Alawan arrived, she brought Seraphine with her. I had half expected it. Seraphine was her shadow of late, a woman of 28, with sharp cheekbones and an appetite for other people's resources. Her perfume filled the room before her laughter did. "Tea?" I asked, my voice even. Alawan sat heavily in the chair across from me, her bracelet catching the afternoon light. "Sure, Mom. It's not every day you roll out the royal set." Seraphine smirked. "Looks like a fancy occasion." "Yes," I said, pouring the tea with steady hands. "It is." For several minutes we sipped and nibbled at the cornbread. Small talk sputtered comments about the neighborhood, about Seraphine's latest excursion to New Orleans, about anything but the charred skeleton still sitting in my driveway. Then, when the silence stretched thin, I reached for the remote. The television came alive with a flicker, and the footage began to play. The driveway, the Mercedes, the hooded figure, the gas can, tilting the flames catching, and finally, the unmistakable glint of jade at the wrist. Seraphine's fork clattered against her plate. Alawan's face tightened, her eyes darting to mine. "What is this?" she hissed. I folded my hands on the table. "It is the truth." Her voice rose sharp and trembling. "You think this proves something? Anyone could have been wearing that bracelet. You've always hated me having friends over what if it was one of them. You can't pin this on me, then why?" I asked softly. "Did you smile as the flames grew?" Color drained from her cheeks, then returned in a furious flood. "You're delusional. Always looking for a villain to justify your paranoia. Maybe if you weren't so controlling, I wouldn't have to fight for anything at all." Seraphine sat frozen, her gaze bouncing between us. Alawan slammed her palm against the table, rattling the cups. "You can't just ambush me like this. You don't get to play judge and jury." I held her gaze calm against her storm. "I am not playing anything. I am telling you what comes next. There will be restitution. You will attend therapy. And there will be no more cash." Her mouth fell open. For once, she had no immediate retort. The silence stretched until she pushed her chair back with a screech. "Restitution, therapy. What am I, a criminal? You committed arson, Alawan," I said evenly. "That is criminal, but you are also my daughter, and I am giving you a chance to repair what can be repaired." Her eyes glittered with fury, and for a moment I thought she might throw the cup against the wall. Instead, she turned on Seraphine. "Say something." Seraphine swallowed hard, then muttered, "Maybe you should listen." The betrayal on Alawan's face was instant. She stormed toward the door, spitting words over her shoulder. "You'll regret this. You'll regret humiliating me." The slam of the door shook the china in its cabinet. I gathered the dishes, slowly stacking them with care, my hands steady, even as my heart raced. The truth was, on the table now, undeniable and breathing. Alawan had been stripped of her mask, and the next move, whether shame or sharper lies, was hers alone. And I knew the storm was far from over, because the path she chose would decide the battles yet to come. The morning after the confrontation, Matthias arrived at the house carrying a leather portfolio. His presence filled the room with a steadiness I had been craving. While the fire had reduced metal and rubber to ash, Matthias moved as if no flame could ever touch him. He greeted me with a firm nod, set the portfolio on the dining table, and unfastened the clasp. "Aurelia," he said, sliding a stack of papers forward, "this is not a punishment, it's a safeguard. If Alawan agrees, she'll sign a civil agreement acknowledging the damage, promising restitution, and committing to therapy sessions. It spares her a courtroom, but it keeps you protected. Without it, the insurance claim could grow messy and the law less forgiving." I studied the pages, each line written with the precision of a scalpel. It was both a shield and a mirror, reflecting the reality I had resisted for too long. My daughter's betrayal had crossed from family into legal territory. The doorbell rang before I could answer. Alawan walked in her chin, lifted high, Seraphine trailing behind like an echo. My daughter didn't look at me. She looked at Matthias with the same suspicion she reserved for authority. "More papers," Mom Alawan sneered. "Is this what you think family looks like now?" Signatures and signatures. Matthias's voice was even. "Family is built on trust. When that is broken, paper ensures what words no longer can." Alawan scoffed, but Seraphine's gaze lingered on the documents. Her lips pressed thin, and I caught the flicker of unease in her eyes. "Sit," I said, gesturing to the chairs. "You will read this, and if you want any chance of repair, you will sign." Alawan dropped into the chair with exaggerated carelessness, flipping through the pages. Her laugh rang hollow. Restitution. Therapy. What's next? Ankle monitors. Seraphine leaned over her shoulder, reading quickly. Then, almost without warning, she pushed the pages back toward Matthias. "She won't sign this." Alawan turned on her. "Excuse me." Seraphine's voice shook, but she didn't falter. "Don't look at me like that, Elle. I've stood beside you through too many messes, but this one, I won't burn with you." Matthias raised an eyebrow. I stayed silent, watching, as the fracture widened. Seraphine straightened her back, her tone low but clear. "Tell her, Elle. Tell your mother what you told me before you lit that match. How you said if the car disappeared, you could claim it stolen. Insurance money, leverage sympathy. You called it the theft trick. You thought it would force her hand, make her pay, make her bend." The room froze. My breath caught in my throat, though I kept my expression steady. Alawan's face drained of color, then reddened as rage surged in. "You liar," she shouted. "You twisted everything. You enough." I said, my voice sharper than it had been in years. "Seraphine has no reason to lie, and you, Alawan, have given me every reason to doubt." Alawan's hands trembled on the edge of the table, her eyes darting wildly between us. It wasn't supposed to. I didn't mean she swallowed her words, but the silence condemned her more than any confession could. Matthias calmly slid the agreement back toward her. "You can keep talking, or you can sign. If you don't, the police will hear every detail planned, arson disguised as theft. Choose carefully." For once, Alawan had no performance left. She sat rigid, breathing shallow, cornered not by me, but by her own schemes unraveling. I rose, lifting the teapot, and poured myself a fresh cup. The papers lay between us, their ink weightier than any chain. And as I sipped, I realized this battle was no longer only between mother and daughter. It had drawn in the very friends Alawan thought would shield her. The betrayal was widening, spilling beyond blood, and I braced myself for what must follow next. By the end of the week, the neighborhood no longer belonged to me. It belonged to whispers. Every time I walked down the drive, I felt them brush against me, thin and sharp as nettles. Curtains shifted. Lawn sprinklers seemed to hiss louder. Faces turned politely away, but their silence carried the same refrain: Duval's daughter burned her car. They weren't wrong. The lie Alawan tried to sell had already unraveled, and though the evidence had not yet been shown beyond my walls, rumor spread faster than paper. The skeleton of the Mercedes in the driveway was proof enough for speculation. For 2 mornings, I considered Retreat keeping the story folded neatly in Matthias's papers, speaking only to those who needed to know. But Retreat had shaped too much of my life already. I had once silenced myself for Elowen's grief, for Silas's business reputation, for the comfort of others. And what had silence given me? A daughter who mistook indulgence for power and believed fire could bend me. So when Marigold Hensley knocked again, holding her gardening gloves in one hand, I invited her to sit on the porch with me. I poured lemonade into 2 glasses, and I told her everything. Not the softened version, not the gossip's gloss everything. She listened without flinching, her sharp eyes fixed on me as though she were reading a ledger. When I finished, she took a long sip, then set her glass down. "Children," she said at last, "learn the limits we enforce. You gave her silk when you should have given her stone. And now she's testing which you'll be." Her words struck with the clarity of bells. I thought of Silas's letters of the lockbox that had endured when the car had not of the choice still hanging in the air. "Do you think I've ruined her?" I asked. Marigold shook her head. "No. She chose her path. But you have a chance now. If you let the whispers tell the story, she remains a mystery to them, and you remain a mother who hides. If you tell the truth yourself, you control the frame. Dignity lives in light, Aurelia, not in shadows." I leaned back, the wooden chair creaking beneath me. Light, not shadows. I had spent years dimming my voice, softening my edges, allowing others to imagine me fragile so they might feel strong. But fragility was no longer protection. It was invitation. That afternoon, I called a small meeting at the community center. Only a handful came, neighbors who had known me for decades, others who had only moved in within the last 5 years. They sat in folding chairs waiting for an explanation. I stood before them, holding neither papers nor photographs, only my voice. I told them my daughter had set fire to the car, that I had proof that the law was aware. I told them it was not gossip but fact, and that my silence would no longer protect anyone's comfort but Elowen's. There were murmurs, nods, a few startled gasps. But what struck me most was the shift in the air. The whispers, so sharp and cutting, softened into something else: acknowledgement, respect, perhaps even relief. When I left the center, Marigold squeezed my arm. "You did right. A lie rots in silence. The truth stands taller when spoken aloud." That night, as I returned home, the house no longer felt like a stage for scandal, but like a fortress I had reclaimed. Elowen might rage, Seraphine might retreat, the community might talk for months, but I had chosen light, and light, once invited, has a way of lingering. I closed the door behind me, knowing that tomorrow would bring Elowen's response, and with it, the next battle I could no longer avoid. The civil agreement once signed was no longer just paper. It became the map of Elowen's days. Restitution meant labor, not handouts, and Matthias had arranged for her to begin at a small cleaning firm run by a widow I trusted. The irony was sharp. Elowen, who had never scrubbed so much as her own teacup, would now spend her hours dusting offices and washing floors. The first morning, she arrived at the firm in silk trousers and heels far too delicate for the work. I watched from a distance as the manager, Mrs. Pennington, handed her a uniform and directed her toward a mop bucket. Elowen's scowl could have curdled milk. At home, I imagined her slamming the bucket against the tiles, muttering about humiliation. I pictured her manicured hands wrapped around sponges, her nails bending under rubber gloves. A pang of guilt threaded through me, but I silenced it with Marigold's words. Children learn the limits we enforce. The reports trickled in slowly. At first, Mrs. Pennington told me Elowen showed up late, dragging her feet, leaving streaks on the glass she was meant to polish. She complained of back pain, allergies, even fainting spells, all miraculously cured the moment the shift ended. The other workers avoided her, weary of her sharp tongue. But Inspector Rourke had agreed to oversee her progress, his presence both formal and watchful. He visited the firm weekly, not in uniform, but his authority carried in his posture and his questions. The first time he observed, he told me later, Elowen barely touched the mop until she saw him enter the room. Then suddenly she moved faster. Though clumsily, her glare cutting at him with every stroke. She wants to prove she's above it, he said when we met outside the firm. But the work doesn't bend to pride. Either she adapts or the floor stays dirty, and the floor always wins. Weeks passed, and small cracks began to show in her resistance. Mrs. Pennington reported she arrived on time more often, if only to avoid Rourke's disapproval. She still rolled her eyes, still muttered under her breath, but her hands were raw now, the skin learning the texture of bleach and soap. One afternoon, I stopped by with a tin of lemon cookies, pretending it was for the staff at large. Elowen spotted me and stiffened. Her cheeks flushed. She was on her knees, scrubbing a corner of the lobby floor. For the briefest moment, our eyes met. Hers were filled with fury, yes, but beneath it, something else flickered. Not shame exactly, but awareness. A recognition that labor had its own gravity, that it pulled her down whether she fought it or not. I left the cookies with Mrs. Pennington and said nothing to Elowen. Silence this time was not indulgence, it was a boundary. When Rourke visited me later that evening, he leaned against my porch railing, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. She's beginning to understand consequence, he said. I won't claim it's repentance, but it's friction, and friction shapes stone. I studied him, searching his face for certainty. Do you believe she can change? He shrugged. Change isn't belief, Mrs. Duval. It's repetition. If she keeps showing up, the seed might take root. If not, resentment will choke it. Either way, the soil's been tilled. I thought of Silas's letters of the Mercedes of the firelight, reflecting off that cursed bracelet. I thought of how many years I had poured into Elowen without ever demanding anything back. Perhaps this at last was the asking. That night, I placed the lockbox back on the desk and traced the outlines of the envelopes inside. The money was safe. The letters were safe. The only uncertain element was my daughter caught between punishment and the faint beginnings of labor's lesson. And I knew the days ahead would test not just her resolve, but mine, as the balance between consequence and compassion grew sharper with every passing hour. The lockbox had sat in my study for weeks, its weight a constant reminder of the line between destruction and survival. Elowen had tried to turn that car into ashes, believing the fire would undo me. But the money had endured, as had Silas's letters, and I could no longer let them sit untouched. They were meant for more than memory, they were meant for use. So one brisk morning, I carried $50,000 in cashier's checks to the community center on Maple Avenue. The building wasn't much to look at. Peeling paint, a crooked sign, but within its walls gathered women whose lives mirrored too many chapters of my own. Widows, mothers, left behind, workers worn to the bone by jobs that paid too little and demanded too much. Matthias met me at the door, briefcase in hand, his eyes as steady as ever. 3 grants today, he reminded me, though his tone was softer than usual. You don't have to give them all at once. I know, I said. But waiting never saved anyone. Inside, the women sat in folding chairs, their faces wary, tired but hungry for something they could hardly name. I recognized that hunger. I had worn it myself in the years after Silas passed, when the company's debts nearly swallowed me whole, and every smile I offered the world was stitched from scraps of hope. I spoke briefly not as a benefactor, but as one of them. I told them the money came from a fund for resilience, a word I had clung to like a lifeline. This isn't charity, I said. It's investment. In you, in what you can build. The first grant went to Lydia Herrera, a woman in her 40s who had been cleaning houses since her husband left. She wanted to open her own laundry service, something modest but steady. When she received the envelope, her hands shook. I didn't think anyone believed I could do more than scrub other people's floors, she whispered. The second went to Shonda Bell, barely 30, raising 2 children on her own after escaping a violent home. She planned to start a catering business, her recipes scrawled in notebooks that had survived more moves than she could count. Cooking is the only thing that makes me feel whole, she said, clutching the check like it was air itself. The third was for Irene Polk, 62, who wanted to buy second-hand sewing machines and teach local girls tailoring skills. Her hair was silver, her back bent, but her eyes burned with the same determination I remembered in Silas's. They call me old, she said, but thread doesn't care how old your hands are. It only asks you to guide it. As each woman rose to accept her grant, I felt a quiet pride blossom inside me, not the brittle kind that comes from possessions or appearances, but the kind that grows from knowing you've bent fate, however slightly, toward justice. Afterward, Matthias and I lingered in the hall while the women talked among themselves. Their voices lifted, weaving dreams into the air. He looked at me, his expression unreadable for a moment, then softened. You've lost much, Aurelia. But this is gain. I nodded, though my throat was tight. Eowyn will never understand it. Not now, maybe not ever. Perhaps not, he said. But legacy isn't always blood. Sometimes it's choice. We stepped outside into the cold, the sound of their laughter spilling through the door behind us. For the first time in weeks, the air didn't feel like smoke. It felt like morning. I held that feeling close as I drove home past the charred remains of the Mercedes still waiting for removal, past the whispers that lingered on the sidewalks. My house might be fractured, my daughter distant, but somewhere in the city, 3 women were holding envelopes that meant a future. And in that truth, I felt Silas beside me again, reminding me that resilience was never forged in comfort, but in fire. When I pulled into the drive, I knew the next battle would not be with money, but with blood, as Elowyn's shadow waited restlessly behind my door. It was late evening when Elowyn appeared in my doorway, her hair damp as if she'd rinsed away the day's labor. She looked smaller somehow, but her eyes still held the restless fire that had always undone her. She didn't ask to come in. She simply crossed the room and dropped onto the chair opposite my desk. "Mom," she began, her voice low, urgent. "We don't have to drag this out. Just give me a lump sum and I'll pay it all back to the firm. It ends faster, no more humiliation. Please." Her fingers twisted together, and for a flicker of a moment, I saw the girl she once was, the child who had begged for toys, for dresses, for whatever glittered in shop windows, always wanting more, never seeing the cost behind it. I set down my pen and met her gaze. "You think money erases lessons, but that's not what this is about." She leaned forward. "Why not you have it? You could end this with one signature, one transfer. Why drag me through this charade of mopping floors and scrubbing toilets? Because it isn't a charade, I said quietly. It's consequence. Respect, first entry. Second, if you want your life back, you have to earn it. There is no shortcut through fire. Her lips parted, then pressed tight again. The silence stretched heavy as lead. Then came the storm. She shot up from the chair, her voice sharp enough to slice the air. You think this makes you noble? It makes you cruel. You'd rather watch me crawl than see me stand. I kept my voice steady. I'd rather see you stand because you've learned to walk, not because I carried you. She turned on her heel, the door slamming hard enough to rattle the glass in its frame. For a long time after I sat alone, Silas's letters resting in the drawer at my side, the weight of them grounding me. The next morning, Mrs. Pennington called. Elowyn had shown up late, resentful but present. She had picked up the mop again. And though her complaints filled the room, her hands still moved inch by inch across the dirty tiles. I thanked Mrs. Pennington and hung up, staring out at the charred remains of the Mercedes, still sitting in my drive. Elowyn had begged for the shortcut, but the long road remained hers to walk. And I knew that only time would reveal whether it would teach her value or break her entirely. When I closed the curtains, the echo of her anger still lingered in the room, preparing me for the next reckoning that I knew would come. Months passed, and the sharp edges of those early days began to smooth. Elowyn still bristled at the work, but she showed up. She learned how to mix cleaning solutions, how to polish brass without streaks, how to wipe fingerprints from glass doors, until her own reflection stared back at her. Mrs. Pennington reported fewer complaints, fewer tantrums. Inspector Rourke noted that she no longer froze when he entered the room, but instead bent her head and continued. It was progress uneven and halting, but progress all the same. One evening in late spring, after she had finished her shift, Elowyn came into the kitchen while I was preparing tea. Her face was tired, not painted in defiance, but softened by exhaustion. She lingered by the counter, her fingers trailing the edge of the teacup. "Mom," she said carefully, "I heard you're holding another grant night at the community center next week." "Yes," I answered, not looking up. 3 women will receive support. They've worked hard for their proposals. She nodded slowly. "I'd like to come. To help, maybe? Hand out the papers, set up chairs. I don't know." I studied her face, then searching for the mask she had so often worn. But there was no smirk, no calculated tilt of her voice. Only something closer to humility, though fragile as porcelain. "You may come," I said at last, "but only under one condition." Her brows lifted. "What?" "No lies and no requests. You help because you choose to, not because you want something in return." She swallowed and nodded. "All right." That night, after she'd gone upstairs, I lingered in the study. I opened the drawer where I kept Silas's letters, touched their edges, then powered on my computer. I don't know what compelled me, habit, caution, perhaps instinct. But I clicked through the shared folder Elowyn had once used so freely, the one I had access to long before the fire. And there it was. The video. The stream she had filmed as the Mercedes burned her face lit by flames, the faint shadow of her smile. Saved under a different name tucked in a corner, she thought I would never find. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the screen bathing the room in cold light. For a long time, I simply stared at the frozen frame, the fire still crackling in memory. My fingers hovered over the mouse, tempted to delete it to erase the last proof of her cruelty. but I didn't. Instead, I closed the folder, shut off the computer, and returned to the letters. Elowen wanted to help now, perhaps sincerely, perhaps not. The video proved she hadn't let go of what she'd done, but maybe that too was part of her reckoning. Sometimes we keep our sins longer than our virtues, carrying them like stones until they drag us down or teach us how to climb. I blew out the lamp, the house settling into silence around me. Whatever test lay ahead would not come from what I uncovered, but from what she chose to reveal or bury on her own. And I knew the next grant night would tell me whether her bridge was still standing or already half burned. The community center buzzed with low voices and the clatter of folding chairs. This time, Elowen arrived early. Sleeves rolled up her hair, pulled back simply. She didn't wait for me to instruct her. She carried stacks of chairs across the hall, lined them in rows, and even paused to straighten the ones that wobbled. The sight made something stir inside me. Not quite trust, but the faint shadow of what trust might look like if it were given another chance. As guests began to file in, I stood at the podium with Matthias nearby. The air felt warm with anticipation, with the fragile hope of women who had written their futures into proposals and now waited for them to be read aloud. One woman, Marla Jenkins, took the microphone and spoke of her failures. The bakery she had opened too quickly, the debt that followed the nights she wondered if dignity could survive foreclosure. When she asked for a second chance, her voice shook, but her eyes glowed with something steady. The room held its breath. Then the applause came honest and whole. I glanced at Elowen. She had stopped arranging papers and was staring at Marla as if she were seeing a mirror she didn't expect. Her hands lingered on the back of a chair, her knuckles pale. For once, her face carried no mask, only a rawness she didn't try to hide. When the evening ended and the crowd dispersed, Elowen stayed behind to help fold chairs, stacking them neatly against the wall. The room quieted until it was only the two of us, the echoes of voices fading into the night. She approached me slowly, her palm closed around something that caught the light. Without a word, she held it out. A key. My spare Mercedes key, the one I had thought long lost stolen during those restless weeks when she prowled through drawers and demanded what wasn't hers. It gleamed, polished, as though she had carried it often, perhaps even planned to use it again. Her voice was hushed, uneven. I took it. I kept it. I don't know why, but I don't want it anymore. I reached out my fingers, brushing hers as I accepted the metal. The weight of it felt heavier than the car it once unlocked. I still keep a spare key, I whispered, closing my fist around it. Not for intrusion, only for respect. She lowered her eyes, nodding, once the silence between us thicker than any apology she might have spoken. When we left the center together, the night air was cool, carrying the scent of magnolias and the quiet possibility that something, however small, might yet be rebuilt. And as I locked the door behind us, I wondered, if respect finally knocks, do you open the door or guard it forever? Outline,